The silence of high noon in the sagebrush territory was a physical weight. The year was 1887, and the heat pressed down like a hot iron, squeezing the life from the gray-green scrub and baking the earth into a red, cracked plate. The air was so still you could hear the buzz of a fly 100 yards away. Then, the silence broke. It was not a crack, but a pound, a slow, heavy thud, thud, thud that vibrated up from the packed earth, a rhythm that was too heavy for the thin, dry air. It was the sound of a single rider, but one with the weight of a freight wagon. A silhouette appeared against the shimmering line of the horizon, distorted by the waves of heat rising from the ground, seeming at first to be an impossible, mythical thing. But it didn't dissolve. It grew, solidifying as it moved up the dusty, forgotten track that led to the ruin known as the Broken Lantern Ranch. On the rotting porch of the main house, what was left of it? Jonas Merrick waited. He was a tall man, tall and pared down by solitude and starvation until he was little more than dried sinew and sharp bone. A ragged beard, more salt than pepper, clung to his jaw, failing to hide the gauntness of his cheeks. His gray eyes, the color of a winter sky, held the flat, tired look of a man who had spent too many years alone, watching his own world die. The sun beat on his bare head. He felt a single bead of sweat form at his hairline and trace a familiar, stinging path down his temple, across his jaw, and into the old, puckered scar that circled his neck like a permanent noose. It felt like a hot wire laid against his skin. He didn't wipe it away. His gaze was fixed on the approaching figure, his body so tense it ached. He didn't need to see the rider clearly to know who it was. Only one person rode that slow, that heavy, and only one person had any reason to come to this graveyard. The horse, a big roan that looked as weary as the land itself, finally stopped in the center of the yard, kicking up a final, lazy puff of alkali dust. The rider dismounted. It was not a graceful slide from the saddle. It was a solid, deliberate planting of two massive boots on the ground, and the horse visibly sighed in relief as the weight was lifted. This was an Abaloma. She was, in a word, a giant, not in the way of a circus freak, all strange proportions, but in the way of a mountain or an ancient redwood. She stood nearly as tall as Jonas, but where he was a sliver, she was a fortress. Her shoulders were broader than any man's he had ever seen, strong enough, it seemed, to carry the sky itself. Her skin was the color of burnt copper, weathered by a lifetime of sun and wind, pulled taut over strong cheekbones and a wide, firm jaw. Deep black eyes, set under a heavy brow, took in the porch, the collapsing barn, and finally, the man. They were eyes that had seen too much and given away nothing. A single thick braid of hair, black as a raven's wing, lay heavy over one shoulder, almost touching the belt at her waist. She wore a simple dark skirt and a man's canvas shirt. The fabric stretched taut across the powerful swell of her chest and arms. She didn't walk toward the porch so much as she advanced on it. Her boots left deep, clear prints in the dust where Jonas's would have barely left a scratch. She stopped, not at the bottom step, but 10 feet out, forcing him to look down at her, though she was nearly his equal in height even from the ground. She looked at him, her black eyes unblinking, seeming to see right through his skin to the weak, failing core of him. When she spoke, her voice was a deep rumble, a gravelly sound like heavy stones grinding together in a dry riverbed. It was low and rough, but it carried across the yard with the force of a bell. 3 months you haven't paid the lease. Jonas Merrick. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the finality of a judge's sentence. Each word landed on him. A physical blow, heavy as the hoofbeats that had announced her. Jonas's hand, raw and calloused, tightened on the brim of his ruined felt hat. He twisted the damp, greasy material until his knuckles turned white. Shame burned in his gut, hot and acidic. A taste he had come to know as well as cheap whiskey, but it was laced with a familiar, bitter defiance, the last refuge of a man who had nothing else. He looked away from her, out at the scorched pasture, at the empty, broken-backed corrals. "You know what happened?" he muttered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "The drought burned everything to the root. What the heat didn't kill, the rustlers took—" He swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. "They ran off the last 20 head a month ago. There's nothing left, no coin." He finally forced his gaze back to hers, a last desperate spark of his old pride flaring in his tired eyes. "I just got these 2 hands and a back that hasn't snapped. That's all that's left of Jonas Merrick." Annabel Loma watched him, her expression as unchanging as the flat-topped mesas in the distance. She was not moved by his plight. The land was harsh, and it bred harsh people. She had seen worse. She had lived worse. "The land doesn't care about excuses," she said, her voice cutting through his defiance like a cold knife. "And neither do I. If you have no coin, you will pay with service." She stepped onto the first porch step. The old wood groaned in protest, sinking visibly under her weight. The movement brought her face level with his. The sheer size of her was overwhelming. He could smell the dust on her clothes, the faint scent of horse and leather, and something else, something clean and sharp, like sage. "From the first light at dawn until the cook fire is out at night, you will do as I say," she commanded. Her voice was quiet now, but more dangerous. "You will mend what's broken. You will haul what's heavy. You will tend to what's left. You are mine." "Jonas Merrick," she paused, letting the words sink in, letting them brand him. "Mine until this debt is paid in sweat." The words struck Jonas with the force of a physical blow, right in his hollow gut. "You are mine." The humiliation was so total, so absolute. It almost made him laugh, a dry, cracked sound. He, Jonas Merrick, a white man, a rancher, or he had been, was now the property of an Apache widow, on his own land. The bitter, searing irony of it was enough to choke him. This land was his birthright. His grandfather had carved it from the wilderness, and his father had been buried on the hill overlooking the creek. And he, Jonas, had lost it. He had pissed it away. He had sold it, piece by agonizing piece, to her husband, Hector Vega, that quiet, calculating man who saw the future in the rocks and the water that Jonas had only seen as background. He had sold this very ranch, the Broken Lantern, to Hector to keep the bank from taking it, to pay off the whiskey debts and the gambling losses from that one terrible winter in Tucson. He had sold his legacy to save his pride, and in doing so, had lost both. Now Hector was dead, killed by rustlers on the pass, and this woman, his giant widow, held the note. His blood boiled. The instinct to spit, to curse, to tell her to go to hell and take her lease with her, rose in his throat. He wanted to reach for the rifle that was leaning, unloaded, just inside the door, but he choked it all down. He remembered. He remembered those long nights. 4 months ago, sitting in this very chair, the cabin dark, the bottle empty. He remembered the cold, heavy comfort of his revolver, the barrel pressed against his temple, the taste of gunpowder and metal on his tongue. He remembered the click as he cocked the hammer, the only thing stopping him a final, lingering thread of pure cowardice. Fate, it seemed, had a much crueler sense of humor. He wasn't dead. He was something worse. He was indentured. He gave a short, sharp nod. The movement was jerky, violent, like a puppet whose strings had been cut and then clumsily retied. Annabel Loma seemed to take his nod as the signature on a contract. She gave a slow blink, as if closing a ledger. She turned her back to him, a move of complete, arrogant confidence, as if she had no fear he might put a bullet in it, and began to walk the perimeter of the yard. She was inspecting her property, and he was part of it. Jonas stayed on the porch, his fingers still mangling the brim of his hat, and he watched her. He watched the way she moved. There was no grace to it, not as other women had, but there was an undeniable, terrifying power. Each step was a solid, certain placement of her foot, as if she were personally stamping her claim onto the earth with every movement, driving it deeper into the planet's core. The fabric of her dark, simple skirt strained against the powerful, visible muscles in her calves and thighs. He saw the sheer, solid breadth of her back, The way her braid lay against it like a thick, black rope. She was a figure of absolute intimidation, a warning. And yet, as he watched her bend to test a loose fence post with one large, capable hand, a different, unwelcome thought flickered in the back of his mind. It was a strange and unsettling pull, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a decade, something he thought had been burned out of him with the whiskey and the loss. It was the confusing, dangerous, and baffling awareness that this giant, this widow, this Apache who now owned him, was, in her own terrifying way, compelling. The sun began its slow, cruel descent, painting the dust in the air a bloody, bruised orange, a stubborn rail of a man, broken but not yet bowed, and a giant widow. Holding the chains of his past, they stood there, two solitary figures in a landscape that wanted to kill them both, now chained together by debt and history. They didn't know it yet. They couldn't. This debt wasn't just about coin. It was about blood. It was about water. And it was about the heart itself. Jonas Merrick woke before the first hint of gray light touched the cracked earth. He had slept in his clothes in the empty, hollow-sounding house, and his bones ached with a familiar, cold stiffness. He was on his feet, his boots in his hand, before the sun had even thought about rising. This was not obedience. This was pride. He would not be summoned like a dog. He would not give Anaba Loma the satisfaction of rousing him. He was a man of the broken lantern, even if he no longer held the deed. He would work this land, not because she commanded it, but because it was all he knew how to do. He would prove, to her and to himself, that he was no slave, no simple beast of burden. He stepped onto the porch, the air sharp and cold against his skin, a cruel reminder of the blistering heat that would soon follow. He didn't go to the well. He headed for the barn. There were tools to inventory, tack to check. His mind was already turning over the long list of failures that needed mending. He pulled his hat low, his shoulders set in a line as stubborn as the horizon. He stopped. He stood a full 20 yards from the barn, but he could see it. The pre-dawn light was just strong enough to reveal the raw, pale wood where a knife had been at work. He walked closer, his boots slow in the dust, a cold, sick feeling rising in his throat that had nothing to do with hunger. There, on the wide, warped plank of the main barn door, gouged deep into the timber, were 4 words. The cuts were savage, deep, and unmistakably fresh. A small pile of pale wood shavings, like sawdust, lay on the dirt below, untouched by the wind. "You are her beast." Jonas read the words once, twice. He felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a hot, dark flush that climbed his scarred neck and settled in his jaw. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his fingernails digging into his palms. It was a brand, a public declaration of his shame, carved into his own property by some coward in the night. Then a new, colder dread hit him. He turned, his eyes scanning the eastern perimeter. He knew it before he saw it. The top wire of the barbed fence was cut clean. The bottom wire was pulled down, posts kicked aside. A wide, clear path to the open range. He ran to the gap, his long legs eating up the ground, but he knew it was too late. The tracks were clear in the damp morning soil, a half-dozen shod horses, and the distinctive, thin wheels of a buckboard. They had driven his last few head of cattle 4, maybe 5 cows and a yearling calf, the pathetic remnant of his herd straight through the gap. The tracks led east, away from the ranch, heading directly for the jumble of rocks and canyons known as Coyote Glass Ridge. Jonas knew that place. It was a hideout for men who didn't have names, men who worked for coin and asked no questions, hired guns. The humiliation was a physical thing, like swallowing poison. It burned in his gut and constricted his chest. He understood the attack perfectly. It was not just a theft. It was a message, calculated and cruel. It was designed to do 2 things at once. First, it was meant to turn him against Anaba, to make him believe this was her fault, her presence that brought this trouble. Or worse, that she had somehow arranged this to tighten her grip on him. They wanted him to see her as the source of his ruin, the master who couldn't or wouldn't. protect her own property. Second, and more personal, was the carving. You are her beast. It was for every passing rider, every gossip in the nearest town. To see, Jonas Merrick, the rancher, was gone. In his place was an animal, a piece of a livestock owned by an Apache widow. They were not just trying to ruin him. They were trying to unmake him as a man. They move in the dark. The voice was low and gravelly. Coming from directly behind him, he hadn't heard her approach. He spun, his hand instinctively dropping to the empty holster at his hip, a useless, pathetic reflex. Annabelle stood there, a shadow against the brightening sky. Her size seemed to drink the meager light. She was not looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on the barn door, on the 4 raw words. She was as still as a stone monument, but he could feel the coiled tension in her. She walked past him, her heavy boots making no sound on the soft earth. She stopped in front of the door, her shadow falling across the hateful words. For a long moment, she just looked, then, slowly, she lifted one large, calloused hand. She reached out, her fingers broad and strong, and lightly, so lightly, traced the edge of the letter B. Jonas watched, his own anger momentarily forgotten, replaced by a strange, sharp focus. He saw her finger, a finger that looked strong enough to snap a branch, tremble. It was just a fraction of an inch, a tiny, involuntary quiver. But it was there. It was the tremble of someone who had felt the sting of this poison before. Someone who knew its taste intimately. She was used to the hatred, the insults, but this, he realized, this still found a way to hurt. She dropped her hand and turned her head, her black eyes finding his. Her face was a mask of weathered copper, unreadable, but her voice was different. It was lower, heavier, and laced with a weariness so profound it was almost physical. "They want you to believe I'm the one who binds you," she said, her voice rough. "And they want me to believe you are the one who will turn a gun on me." It wasn't a question. It was a simple, brutal summary of their situation. She saw the trap as clearly as he did. Jonas looked from her face back to the door, half buried in the final, deep cut of the last letter. Gleaming in the new light was the tool, the knife. The cowards had left it, perhaps in their haste, or perhaps as a final, cruel flourish. He stepped forward, past her. He wrapped his hand around the rough wooden handle and pulled. The blade came free with a sharp, sucking sound. Shink! From the wood! It was a cheap, heavy skinning knife. He held it in his hand, the weight of it familiar. He could feel her presence behind him, vast and silent. He knew what she was thinking. He knew what the men who did this wanted him to be thinking. Here he was, the beast, armed, standing next to his mistress. He turned, slowly. He held the knife out to her, not by the blade, but by the hilt. His gaze was as cold and flat as a winter river. "Then let's see what happens when they come back," he said, his voice a low, hard rasp. "Let's see what this beast and his mistress will do to them." It was not a sneer. It was not a joke. It was a vow, raw and bitter, sealed in the cold morning air. Annabelle looked at the knife, then at his face. Her black eyes held his for 3 long, silent seconds. Then her large hand closed over his, her grip firm and dry, and she took the knife. She did not sheath it. She held it, loosely, at her side. "There is work," she said, and the day began. It was a day of brutal, silent labor. There were no orders given, none were needed. They both knew what had to be done. They were no longer owner and debtor, master and servant. They were 2 hands, all that stood between the broken lantern and its complete collapse. They started with the fence. He handled the wire stretcher, his lean muscles straining, while she, with the strength of 2 men, lifted and set new posts into the hard ground, tamping the earth with her heavy boots. Her power was efficient, practical. She wasted no movement. The sun climbed, and the heat returned, pressing down on them, turning the dry air into a furnace. Sweat ran in rivers down his back and chest, soaking his shirt until it clung to him. It carved clean paths through the layers of dust on his face. He looked at Anaba. She was working just as hard. her breathing deep and even. The sun made her copper skin glam, and her dark canvas shirt was patched with sweat, defining the broad, powerful muscles of her back and shoulders. By noon, the fence was mended. It was a patchwork job, but it would hold. They moved to the well. It was the only source of water for miles, and it was failing. The water level was dangerously low. For an hour, they took turns, hauling the heavy, soaked wooden bucket up, hand over hand, pouring the precious, silt-filled water into the stock trough. When it was his turn to pull, his arms, already aching, burned as if they were on fire. When it was her turn, she pulled the rope with a steady, relentless rhythm, her biceps flexing, the muscles in her forearms standing out in sharp relief. They did not speak. The only sounds were the scrape of the rope, the groan of the wooden pulley, and their own harsh breathing. They found 2 cows and a calf huddled in the meager shade of a rocky outcrop. The rustlers had missed them. Jonas moved to herd them, but Anaba simply walked toward them, her steps slow and unthreatening, making a low, soft sound in her throat. The animals, usually skittish, watched her, their ears pricked, and allowed her to guide them back to the broken-down corral. They worked until the late afternoon, the sun a merciless eye in the sky. Finally, Anaba nodded toward the porch. "We rest." They sat, not next to each other, but on the same porch, 2 yards apart, leaning against the warm, rough wood of the house. They were both covered in a thick paste of sweat and red dust. Jonas felt salt stinging the cut on his neck. He wiped his face with a greasy bandana, and the cloth came away caked in mud. Anaba had a small water skin. She drank, then held it out to him. He took it, drank, and handed it back. She was rubbing her right forearm, her sleeve pushed up past the elbow. Jonas's gaze fell on her arm. The skin was bronze, smooth, and laced with muscle, and it was marked. Just below her elbow, running almost to her wrist, was a scar. It was not the puckered, angry scar of a burn, nor the ragged mark of an accident. It was a long, thin, perfectly straight line, white and pale against her darker skin. It was the deliberate, clean mark of a knife, laid open and left to heal badly. It was an old wound, but it was stark. The question was out of his mouth before he could stop it. His voice was hoarse. "Did they do that to you?" Anaba's hand stopped rubbing. She looked down at the white line, as if noticing it for the first time. She traced it with the fingers of her other hand, the same way she had traced the letters on the barn. She looked up, not at him, but at the bruised purple line of the distant mountains. Her expression did not change. "Men did," she said, her voice flat, empty of all emotion. "The name doesn't matter." She pulled her sleeve down. The sun began to bleed into the horizon, setting the sky on fire. They sat in the growing shadows, the silence between them thicker than the dust. There are carvings on wood, and there are carvings on skin. The mind might forget the letters, but the heart never forgets who held the knife. The day's brutal labor had settled into their bones, a deep, grinding ache. Night fell, not with the gentle softness of the east, but as a sudden, sharp cutting of the light. The immense, star-filled blackness of the territory sky pressed down, and the desert air, which had been a furnace, turned instantly cold, carrying the sharp, clean scent of sagebrush and dry dust. Jonas had built a small, contained fire in the dirt yard, just beyond the porch. He had used the wood from a collapsed section of the corral, the dry timber catching quickly, spitting small red sparks into the darkness. They sat on the porch steps, the small, flickering fire casting their shadows back against the wall of the house. Jonas sat with his elbows on his knees, his gaze lost in the flames. He was empty, hollowed out by the day's work and the raw, public shame of the morning. Anaba sat a few feet from him, her back straight, as if propped against an invisible pillar. The firelight played across the strong, broad planes of her face, catching the copper highlights of her skin and sinking into the deep, dark hollows of her eyes. The wind moved, a low, mournful sigh across the open land, and her shadow, cast huge and distorted by the flames, danced on the wooden wall behind her. It rose up, towering over them both, the shape of her braid looking like the haft of a spear, her broad shoulders like a shield. She looked, in that flickering, uncertain light, like some ancient goddess of war, returned to a battlefield long after the fight, bearing the wounds of all of it. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote. Jonas had no words. He was a man stripped bare, a tenant on his own grave. What was there to say? Then she spoke. Her voice, that low, gravelly rumble, seemed to rise from the earth itself, pulling Jonas from his stupor. She was not looking at him. She was staring into the fire, her black eyes reflecting the small, dancing flames. "My husband, Hector Vega," she began. The name hung in the cold air, a solid, heavy thing. He was not like other men. Jonas turned his head. He had known Hector, but only as a quiet, shrewd man who had outsmarted him, a man who had bought his land. He had never considered him as a person, only as a rival, a symbol of his own failure. "He was Apache," she continued, "but also Mexican. He walked in two worlds, and neither wanted him. For a time, he scouted for the army. He wore the blue coat. He led them through the canyons they could not read, and he watched them do things he watched them." Her voice was flat, a recitation of facts. "He left them. He learned the white man's paper. He learned to use their measuring chains and their sighting tools. He worked for the railroad, surveying the new lines." She picked up a small twig from the porch, her large, calloused hand surprisingly gentle, and tossed it into the fire. The twig vanished in a bright, sudden flare. That is when he found it. While marking a line west of here, he found the true source. Jonas frowned. "Source of what?" "Of everything," she said, a new, harder edge to her voice. "Under the Iron Horse Bluffs, the ones you see to the north." Jonas knew them, a sheer, impassable wall of red rock, considered useless by everyone. "The surveyors saw only rock," Anaba said. "Hector saw the lines. He saw the way the rock was formed. He was Apache. He knew how to listen to the ground. He found the iron, a vein of it, thick as a man's body, running for miles. And he found the water." Jonas sat up straight. The water, not a creek, not a spring, a river, an ancient, underground river. He said it was what fed this land, what fed the deep wells, what kept the high pastures green when everything else died. He said this ranch, the Broken Lantern, was the key, that its well was the deepest tap into that secret water. Jazz 003. Now the pieces began to click into place in Jonas's mind, forming a picture that made him feel sick and foolish. "Hector believed," she said, her voice dropping, "that if the Apache held the paper, the white man's legal paper, for the water and the minerals, they could not be moved. He believed the paper was a stronger weapon than the rifle. He believed the law would protect us, if we used their own law." She turned her head, and for the first time, her black eyes fixed on his. They were not just dark, they were deep, and in their depths, Jonas saw a terrible, cold fire. "He was a fool," she said softly, "but he was a brave one. He made files. He drew a map, a secret one, showing where the aquifer ran, where the iron was thickest. He spent all his money, all the money from the railroad, registering the claims, filing the water rights. Not in his name, but in the name of a trust for the tribe. He was going to take it all to the federal court in Larkspur Junction. He was going to prove the land was not empty, that it was valuable, and that it belonged to the people who had been here since the first sunrise." She turned back to the fire. Her shoulders, so broad and strong, seemed to slump just for a second. "He never made it. He was ambushed on the pass, on his way back home to me. They shot him from the rocks. They said it was road agents. They said they took his horse and his pay." She leaned forward, the firelight catching a new, dangerous glint in her eyes. "But the report was wrong. They didn't take his papers. I found them, hidden in his saddlebag, under a false bottom. The road agents didn't know what to look for. Her voice dropped to a near whisper, a gravelly sound that scraped Jonas's nerves. Besides, road agents don't wear old army hats, and they don't carry government-issue Springfield rifles. A cold, heavy stone settled in Jonas's stomach. He knew those rifles. He knew who carried them. Who? He asked, though he already knew. A man who believes this land is his, by right of conquest, she said. A man who led the massacres at Painted Creek. A man who now wears fine suits and builds railroads, but who is still just a butcher. She spat the name as if it were poison. Colonel Ezra Pike. The name hit Jonas like a slap. Pike. Of course, Pike, the railroad baron, the mining magnate, the man who was strangling the entire territory, buying up politicians and sheriffs like they were cattle. Pike, whose frontier meridian line was meant to cut right through this very valley. And in that one awful, illuminating moment, Jonas Merrick understood everything. He understood what he had done. When he was at his lowest, desperate for whiskey money, desperate to stop the bank from seizing his father's legacy, he had sold off parcels of his land. And the buyer, the quiet, ever-present buyer, had been Hector Vega, and Jonas had hated him for it. But now he saw Hector wasn't buying grazing land. He was buying the Iron Horse Bluffs. He was buying the land that sat atop the water. And then, when the final foreclosure notice came, Jonas had sold this ranch, the Broken Lantern, the heart of it all. To save his skin, he had sold the key. He had not just sold land to an Apache. He had sold the one thing that stood in Ezra Pike's way. And he had done it for a few $100s and a bottle. He felt a wave of self-loathing so strong it made him dizzy. He was an accomplice. He had, without knowing it, handed Pike's enemy a loaded gun, only to take it away and hand it to Pike himself, all for the price of his own pathetic survival. He looked at the woman sitting next to him, this giant, this Apache widow. She had not just lost a husband. She had lost her champion. She had lost her land, her people's hope, and now she was here, alone, on this collapsing ranch, with a broken-down white man as her only property, trying to stand against a man who commanded a private army. The admiration he felt was sharp, painful, and unwelcome. It was mixed with a shame so deep it felt like a physical weight. He saw her, really saw her, for the first time, not as his landowner, not as a giant, but as a woman standing on the ashes of her life, refusing to be moved. The wind picked up, a sudden cold gust that swept down from the bluffs, carrying the chill of the high desert. It tore at the fire, making the flames leap and dance wildly. It whipped Anaba's braid across her shoulder and made her shiver. It was a deep, shuddering tremor that shook her entire, massive frame. Jonas acted without thinking. It was an old instinct, the reflex of a man who had once been a gentleman, or had tried to be. He stood, unhooked his own worn, threadbare canvas coat from the nail by the door, and stepped behind her. He didn't speak. He simply draped the coat over her broad shoulders. It was, he thought, a ridiculous gesture. The coat was ludicrously small on her. It looked like a child's blanket draped over a boulder. The sleeves barely covered her biceps, but he felt her stiffen beneath the fabric. He felt the sudden tension in her back, the way her breathing stopped for a single second. He moved back to his seat, feeling foolish, his skin suddenly cold without the coat. Anaba did not turn. She did not shrug the coat off. Her hands, which had been resting on her knees, slowly came up. Her large, rough fingers touched the worn canvas, tracing the stitched seam on the lapel. She sat that way for a long time. The fire died down to glowing orange embers. The wind settled into a low, steady moan. Then, Jonas saw it. He wasn't sure at first. It was a tiny movement in the firelight. The corner of her mouth, the one facing him, twitched. It was not a smile, not a full smile. It was the barest, slightest upward curve, a hesitant, rusty movement of a muscle that had not been used in a very, very long time. It vanished as quickly as it came, but he had seen it. Sometimes the enemy isn't the man with the gun. Sometimes it is the piece of paper you signed on a desperate, drunken day. And sometimes redemption doesn't come from a prayer. It starts with standing a little closer to the person you thought was your opponent. The fire in the yard had long since died to gray ash, and a deep, bone-chilling cold had settled over the ranch. Jonas was in the main house, not in his bed, but on a cot in the main room. Anaba was somewhere in the back, in the small room that had been his parents', a room he hadn't entered in years. He had his rifle, the old Winchester, loaded and leaning against the wall next to him. He was exhausted, his body a single, unified ache from the day's labor. But his mind was too active. He was listening to the silence, to the vast, empty dark of the territory. He must have drifted, his eyes closing for just a minute, his body finally surrendering to its own exhaustion. He was not asleep, not truly, but in that gray space between. When the first sound ripped him back, it was not a subtle sound. It was the splintering crash of a heavy boot kicking in a fence post, followed by the jangle of metal on wood. And then, horses. Too many horses, moving too fast. Jonas was off the cot, the Winchester in his hand, before his eyes were even fully open. He moved to the window, his heart hammering a sick, fast rhythm against his ribs, and the world turned orange. A bright, sudden bloom of light flared from the side of the barn. He saw them then, a group of them, 7, maybe 8 men, all with bandanas pulled up over their faces, their features lost in the shadows. They were on horseback, but 2 were on the ground, holding torches. They were from Pike's gang. The brutal, efficient way they moved, the lack of any wasted effort. It was the signature of paid men, not common thieves. They were not just setting the barn on fire. They were systematically setting the hay bales, the ones he and Anaba had spent all afternoon stacking, ablaze. They were creating a wall of fire, a funeral pyre for the ranch itself. The dry, ancient wood of the barn, baked by decades of sun, caught almost instantly. Flames, bright and hungry, licked up the side of the building, climbing the walls like a living, laughing animal. A figure appeared in the doorway of the house, silhouetted not by the moon, but by the raging inferno. Anaba. He had never seen her like this. Her thick black braid was gone, her hair unraveled and falling in a wild, dark mass around her shoulders and back, looking like a storm cloud. She wore a simple, thin night shift, and the firelight cast her in living bronze, the shifting light making her muscles seem to ripple. Her body, so large and powerful, seemed to absorb the light and throw it back. She did not look afraid. She looked like a part of the fire itself. She raised her head, and a sound tore from her throat that made the hair on Jonas's scarred neck stand on end. It was not a scream. It was a roar. It was a deep, guttural cry that was part Apache and part pure. Undiluted rage. "Ha!" she yelled. A war cry that cut through the crackle of the flames. And then, in English, her voice like a jagged knife. "Get off my land!" The gunman, startled by this giant, wild-haired figure, turned. One of them, laughing, raised his rifle and fired. The shot went wide, splintering the doorframe next to her. That was all Jonas needed. He was out the window, diving and rolling, coming up behind the low, crumbling stone wall that marked the edge of the old garden. "Here," he yelled, his voice cracking. "Anaba, the wall." She moved. She did not run, but she covered the ground between the porch and the wall in 3 immense, bounding steps, diving behind the cover with an agility that was shocking for her size. The night exploded, the air filled with noise, a deafening, continuous crackle of gunfire. Bullets slammed into the stone wall, sending chips of rock and stinging dust into their faces. Jonas raised his Winchester, sighted on the flash of a rifle, and fired. He worked the lever, the familiar, smooth shuck-shuck of the action, a small, mechanical comfort in the chaos. He fired again. A man yelled, a curse, but the shooting didn't stop. The air was thick with the smell of hell itself, gunpowder, sharp and sulfuric, the dry, hot scent of the burning wood. And something else, something thick and sickening, the smell of burning hair and flesh, as the fire found the 2 cows left in the barn. The sound they made, a high, terrified bellow cut short, turned Jonas's stomach. All this, mixed with the sharp, coppery smell of his own sweat and fear. "They're trying to circle," Annabeth yelled, her voice a low growl beside him. She was right. He saw one of the shadows detach itself from the main group, running low, using the smoke as cover, disappearing around the far side of the burning barn. The man was flanking them. "I see him," Jonas yelled. He stood, just for a second, to get a clear shot over the wall. He raised the rifle, trying to find the moving shadow in the swirling, acrid smoke. He never even heard the shot. It was a sledgehammer. A white-hot fist slammed into his left side, just above the hip, spinning him around. The impact stole his breath, his sight, everything. He didn't feel pain, just a vast, sudden emptiness. His rifle flew from his hands. He hit the ground, hard, the air driven from his lungs in a choked gasp. He was down. He tried to push himself up, but his left arm wouldn't work. His vision was gray and tunneling. He was finished. Then, she was there, a mountain moving. She covered him. He felt one of her massive arms, strong as a steel cable, hook under his armpits. She dragged him, his boots scraping uselessly in the dirt, pulling him back from the wall. Behind the solid, stacked pile of curing firewood he had forgotten was there. He was safe from the main line of fire. But the flanker... "My gun," he gasped, trying to reach for the Winchester. "Hush," she commanded. He felt her hand, not gentle, move to his belt. She ripped his own revolver, the old Colt he had failed to use, from its holster. She checked the cylinder in the firelight, her movements economical, fast, and brutal. Then she was gone. She didn't stay behind the woodpile. She didn't cower. She handed him his empty, useless rifle, as if telling him to hold it, and then she moved. Jonas, lying on his side, his vision swimming, watched her. She trundled, low to the ground, around the other side of the woodpile. She was not a big woman trying to be small. She was a hunter. She was born for this. He saw the flanker. The man, emboldened, was rising from behind the water trough, his pistol up, ready to finish them both. Annabeth rose from the shadows. Not a woman, but an avenger. She was 10 feet from him. The man saw her, his eyes widening in the firelight, his mouth forming a perfect O of shock. He was not just surprised, he was terrified. She did not hesitate. She raised Jonas's revolver with one hand, her arm locked straight, and fired. The boom of the big Colt was deafening. The man was thrown back, as if hit by a mule. She fired again, a second, deliberate, cold shot. The man did not move. Annabeth stood there for a long second, the big pistol smoking in her hand, her hair wild in the orange light. Jonas watched, mesmerized. He saw it then. A dark, wet stain was spreading across the shoulder of her white shift. It ran down her bicep, a glistening, black-red river, dripping from her elbow. She was hit, but she stood as if she felt nothing, her gaze fixed on the other attackers. The fire was now a roaring, unstoppable monster. The main roof of the barn was sagging, and a tornado of red embers was shooting into the night sky. Annabeth turned. She walked back into the open, ignoring the bullets that were still snapping through the air. She stood, her full, massive height revealed, and raised the smoking pistol in the air. She screamed at the remaining, hidden gunmen, her voice carrying over the roar of the fire. "Tell Pike," she bellowed, her English thick with her Apache tongue. "You tell that Udi, if he wants this land, he must walk over my body and the body of the man he made my beast." The shooting stopped. In the sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the collapsing inferno, the gunmen looked at each other. This was not what they had signed up for. This giant, bleeding, half-naked woman, who had just killed one of them without flinching, was not a simple rancher's widow. She was something else. And then, faintly, from the south, came another sound, a thin, high whistle, someone in the distant town, or a passing patrol. had seen the pillar of fire. Help, or at least witnesses. "We're on the way." "That was enough," a voice yelled. "We're done, get out." Jonas heard the scrambling of men, the frantic thud of hooves as they mounted and fled, scattering like wraiths into the darkness of the sagebrush. They were gone. He was left, lying in the dirt, the sound of his own ragged breathing loud in his ears. The entire barn, his father's barn, collapsed in on itself with a final, defeated whoosh and a shower of sparks that lit up the sky. The heat was scorching, even from this distance. He looked down. His side was wet. He pressed his hand to it, and his hand came away dark. It was a graze, deep and bleeding. But the bullet had passed through. It was not a mortal wound, just another scar. He pushed himself into a sitting position, his back screaming in protest, his head swimming. He looked over at Annaba. She was still standing, watching the darkness where the men had fled, but she was no longer a bronze statue. The pistol was hanging, forgotten, in her hand, and in the flickering, dying light of the fire, he could see her, at last, trembling. It was not a shiver from the cold. It was the shock. It was the blood loss. He looked at the burning ruin of the barn, the last of his cattle gone, his side on fire. He felt the familiar, bitter taste of despair. But then he looked at this woman, this giant, wounded, terrifying, brave woman, who was shaking in the firelight, and Jonas Merrick understood. In that moment, with perfect, searing clarity, the cattle didn't matter. The barn didn't matter. The only thing in the entire God-forsaken territory that mattered was the woman standing in the smoke, bleeding for land that was not even hers. That night, Jonas lost his last cattle, and Annaba lost her last barn. But what they had won, huddled together in the dirt and the blood, was something men like Pike, with all their coin and all their guns, could never, ever understand. They had put their lives next to each other, and from that moment on, the lines of owner and debt, of master and beast, were burned away, gone to ash with the rest of the ranch. The sky was a bruised, sick gray when they left. Dawn had not yet broken. This was just the pre-light, filtering through the thick, greasy columns of smoke that still rose from the blackened, skeletal remains of the barn. The smell of ash and cooked meat hung in the air, a thick, choking blanket that coated the back of Jonas's throat. They did not, could not, stay. The attack had been a message. The next one would be an execution. Jonas moved with a stiff, wooden-legged gait. His entire left side was a sheet of fire. The bullet grazed a deep, raw furrow that oozed blood every time he bent or twisted. He had poured the last of his whiskey onto it, a searing, blinding pain that had almost made him black out, and then had tied a strip of a torn-up flour sack over it. It was a pathetic bandage. He went into the gutted, smoke-stained house and salvaged what little was left. 2 hardtack biscuits, dry as stone, a small cloth sack of dried beans, maybe a pound's worth. He found his father's old hunting knife. He put it all into a canvas satchel, his movements jerky and pained. Annaba was by the well, her back to him. She had washed the blood from her arm, which was bare. The bullet had torn a nasty gash through the thick muscle of her shoulder. She was trying to tie a piece of her own torn shift around it, but her arm was too broad, the angle too awkward. She was fumbling, her large, capable hands suddenly clumsy. Jonas stopped, the satchel in his hand. He watched her for a second, this giant of a woman, struggling with a simple knot, her face set in a mask of frustration. He walked into the house, grabbed his only other clean shirt, and walked back to her. He did not speak. He stood in front of her, tore the shirt into long, clean strips, and gestured to her arm. She looked at him, her black eyes unreadable in the gray light. Then, slowly, she nodded and held out her arm. His hands were shaking from the pain or the cold. He wasn't sure. He wrapped the cloth around her bicep, his fingers brushing the warm, smooth copper of her skin. The muscle was as hard as oak. He had to wrap the cloth around and around to cover the wound, and he pulled the knot tight with his teeth, hissing as the movement tore at the wound in his own side. She made no sound. She took the satchel from him, shouldered it herself, and nodded toward the one full waterskin he had managed to grab. "You carry that," she said. Her voice was a low rasp. They left the Broken Lantern Ranch, or what was left of it, without looking back. They did not take the main track. They cut south, walking into the rising sun. Two limping, broken figures against a landscape of red rock and pale, hungry sky. Their destination was Cinder Wells, an old, forgotten stagecoach stop, 2 days' hard walk across the high desert. A place of nothing, but it was. According to Anaba, the place Hector had hidden his one true weapon. "The box that will save this land," he had told her, just before his last ride. A small, iron box, buried beneath the floorboards of the only remaining building. The sun climbed. The gray of the morning burned away, replaced by a blinding, white-hot sky. The world became a furnace. The heat was a physical thing, a blade hanging over their heads, reflecting off the sand and the rock until their eyes watered and their skin felt as if it were cooking. They walked. They walked in silence. The only sound, the crunch-shush of their boots in the sand and gravel, and the ragged sound of their own breathing. Jonas walked with his head down, his hat pulled low, focusing on the simple, agonizing act of putting one foot in front of the other. Anaba walked beside him. She was a moving mountain, and her shadow, vast and dark, fell across him, shielding him from the worst of the sun's direct assault. He walked in her shade, and the irony of it was not lost on him. By noon, his side was on fire. He could feel the bandage, a wet, sticky mess, clinging to his shirt. Every step was a new, fresh stab of pain. He tried to hide it. He tried to match her long, steady stride. But his left leg began to drag, his gait becoming a pronounced, lurching limp. He gritted his teeth, the sweat stinging his eyes, his breath coming in short, sharp hisses. She stopped. He almost walked into her. So focused was he on his own feet. He looked up, annoyed. She was watching him. Her black eyes narrowed against the sun. She had seen the way his jaw was clenched, the way he favored his left side. She said nothing. She simply unhooked the waterskin from her belt. She had taken it from him an hour ago and held it out. He took it, pulled the wooden stopper, and drank. The water was hot, tasting of leather and dust, but it was the most beautiful thing he had ever tasted. He stopped, about to drink more, and then remembered. He stoppered it and held it back out. "Drink," she commanded. "We share." "Drink," she repeated, her voice low. "My beast cannot fall in the middle of the road." The words, the same ones that had been carved into his barn, should have stung. But coming from her, they were something else. A gruff, hard acknowledgement, a strange, twisted kind of care. He drank 2 more swallows and handed it back. She took a single, small sip and rehooked it to her belt. They walked on. The afternoon was an eternity of fire. The sun began its descent, but the heat did not lessen. It was as if the rocks and the sand had soaked it all in and were now breathing it back out. A convection oven that offered no escape. It was Anaba who faltered first. Jonas heard it before he saw it. A sharp, indrawn hiss of breath, like a snake. He looked over. She had stumbled, her long stride broken. She caught her balance, but her right leg, he saw, was now dragging. She was trying to walk on the side of her foot. "What is it?" he asked, his voice a dry crackle. "Nothing," she lied. She took 3 more steps, and this time she winced, her entire body seizing as her right knee buckled. She didn't fall, but she had to stop, leaning heavily against a sun-baked boulder. Her eyes squeezed shut. Jonas looked down. Her knee. There was an old, puckered scar, but he also saw a faint, dark line under the skin, a piece of metal. "Perhaps the knee," she said, her voice tight with a pain that shamed his own. "Old, from the army. When they came for Hector, a piece of their cannon. Shrapnel, a piece of shrapnel, buried in her joint, moving with every step." He watched her, this woman he had seen as a monument, a force of nature. He watched her bite her lip, her broad chest heaving, the sweat on her face not from the heat, but from pure, unadulterated agony. She looked like a statue that had finally, impossibly, begun to crack. He did not think. He did not plan. He was a man running on the dregs of instinct, his body screaming, his mind empty. He walked in front of her. He dropped the water skin, and, bracing his hands on his own aching thighs, he knelt, his back to her. Silence. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her voice thick. "Get on," he rasped. A sound, half laugh, half snort. "You are a fool. You are wounded. I am twice your weight." "Then I suppose," Jonas said, his voice a strained whisper as he looked over his shoulder, "I am carrying the rest of the debt." She stared at the back of his head, at the scarred, corded muscles in his neck. He could feel her gaze on him, heavy as the sun. He heard her shift her weight, heard the groan of pain as she put pressure on her good leg. Then he felt her hands on his shoulders. They were massive. They enveloped him. He braced himself. She did not climb. She simply shifted her weight. A movement of surprising, practiced balance. And he was taking all of it. The world went white. The weight was impossible. It was crushing. It was like trying to lift the world. His knees screamed. His back felt as if it would snap in two. The pain in his side exploded, a fresh, searing wave of agony. A grunt was torn from his chest, but he pushed up, his legs shaking, his entire body a single, vibrating wire of pain. He was standing, barely, he was standing, and she was on his back. "Hold on," he gasped. He felt her arms, her massive, powerful arms, slide from his shoulders and encircle his chest, her hands locking in front of him. It was not an embrace. It was a practical hold, to keep her balance, to anchor her giant frame to his. But it felt he did not know what it felt like. He could feel the solid, warm press of her body against his back, the hard muscle of her thighs locked around his aching hips. Her hot, ragged breath was on his neck, just below his ear. He could feel, or perhaps just imagine, the steady, heavy beat of her heart against his spine. His own heart was a trapped bird, hammering against his ribs. It was from the pain. It was from the effort. It had to be. He took a step. His legs buckled, but he held. He took another. He walked. He did not know for how long. It was not walking. It was a stumbling, agonizing, endless shuffle. He saw nothing but the red sand in front of his boots. He heard nothing but the blood in his ears and the sound of her breath. Close, so close. He was carrying a giant, and he was not failing. Night came. The sun mercifully died, and the cold rushed in to take its place. He was on the verge of collapse when she finally spoke, her voice a rumble against his back. "Here, stop." He saw it, a narrow, dark cleft in a low-rising wall of rock, an alcove, barely tall enough to stand in, barely deep enough to be called a cave. He did not set her down. He stumbled to the entrance and simply let his legs go. He collapsed, falling to his knees, her weight coming down with him, and they tumbled, in a heap of exhausted, pained limbs, onto the soft sand of the shelter's floor. For a full minute, they did not move. They just lay there, tangled together, gasping in the cold, thin air. Finally, Jonas rolled away, his entire body screaming. He crawled to the back of the small space. Annaba, groaning, dragged her bad leg and propped herself against the rock wall. The space was tiny, a small, triangular hole, no more than 6 feet deep and 10 feet wide. With her sitting against the back wall, she filled half of it. Her shadow, even in the dim starlight, seemed to consume the entire space. Jonas, his hands shaking so badly he could barely move them, used his knife and the flint in his satchel to start a fire, a tiny, pathetic fire, made from the few dry, dead weeds he could find near the entrance. It was more smoke than flame, but it was heat. The wind picked up, a high, keening whistle, and it funneled into the mouth of their small shelter, carrying an icy chill. Jonas shivered, his teeth chattering. He looked at Annaba. She was shivering, too, a deep, bone-rattling shake. He had one thing left, the single thin wool blanket from his satchel. He crawled over to her, his knees digging into the sand. He held it out. She looked at the blanket, then at him. "You're the one who carried," she whispered, her voice rough. "You're the one who's bigger," he countered. "You'll freeze faster." He draped the blanket over her wide shoulders. She took the edge of it in her hand. She sat there, the small fire casting dancing, uncertain shadows on her face. He crawled back to his side, huddling against the cold rock, his arms wrapped around his knees, trying to stop shaking. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind howl. He felt, more than saw, her move. A shadow fell over him. He opened his eyes. She had moved, shuffling on the sand, to sit beside him. The space was so narrow. Their thighs were pressed together, his hip bone digging into the solid muscle of her leg. Then she did the last thing he expected. She took the blanket, and with one of her massive, heavy arms, she wrapped it not just around herself, but around him. She pulled him in, against her side. Her arm, as thick as a fence post, came down over his shoulders, pulling him against her, shielding him from the wind that was howling at the entrance. He was rigid. He was pressed against the side of this giant Apache woman. He could smell the smoke from the fire on her, the faint, clean scent of sage, and the coppery tang of her drying blood. He was tucked under her arm, his head barely reaching her shoulder. He could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of her chest, hear the deep, even rhythm of her heart beating just inches from his ear. His own heart was pounding, a frantic drum against the slow, steady beat of hers. The air in the small alcove was thick with the smell of smoke and their own unwashed, wounded bodies. Their breaths mingled, white plumes in the cold. They sat there, in a huddle of shared pain and shared warmth. They did not call it comfort. They did not call it trust. They had not yet named it love. But in a small, cold crack in the rock, as the desert wind screamed outside, their bodies knew. They knew it all. The second day of walking was a silent, waking nightmare. The night in the rock cleft had given them no rest, only a shared, shivering misery. They had finished the last of the hot water before dawn and had walked for hours on nothing but grit and the memory of pain. Anaba's bad knee had stiffened in the cold, and her limp was now as pronounced as Jonas's, but she did not ask for help, and he did not offer it. They were beyond that. They were two broken machines, wound by a single spring, aimed at a single point on the horizon. Cinderwells was not a town. It was a scar. They saw it first as a shimmer, a collection of broken teeth on the flat, sun-baked earth. It had been a stagecoach stop 2 decades ago, but the railroad had killed it, and the desert had reclaimed it. All that remained were the crumbling adobe walls of a long-dead livery and the circular stone lip of the well that gave the place its name. It was, of course, bone dry. But there was one structure still standing, leaning against the side of a rocky outcrop as if for support. It was a shack, built of patched-together plank wood and hope. A weathered, hand-painted sign swung crookedly from one hinge, the letters faded but legible Mabel's Well House. Below it, a promise, warm coffee, cheap whiskey. A single, bony horse was tied to the rail, its head hanging low in the meager shadow of the roof. Jonas paused, his hand on the waterskin. It was empty. "You know this place." "Hector did," Anaba said, her voice a dry rasp. She limped past him, toward the door. Jonas followed. He pushed the door open, a hinge screaming in protest. The inside was dark and blessedly cool. It smelled of dust, stale beer, and the faint, bitter aroma of coffee that had been boiled for too long. A few rough tables were scattered on the packed dirt floor. At the back, a bar made of unplaned planks held a few dusty bottles and a stack of cloudy glasses. Behind it stood a woman. She was not tall, not like Anaba, but she was solid, her body rooted to the earth. She was middle-aged, her skin the color of tanned leather, creased around the eyes by years of sun and knowing. Her hair was a wild, dark, curly mass, shot through with threads of gray. She was wiping the inside of a tin cup with a rag that looked as if it had been gray for a very long time. She looked up as they entered, her dark, sharp eyes taking them in. She saw Jonas, his lanky frame hunched in pain, his face a mask of dried blood, sweat, and dust. His hand clamped to the bleeding wound in his side. Her gaze dismissed him. Then she saw Inaba. She saw the giant Apache woman, her wild hair matted, her shift torn, the matching bloodstain on her shoulder. The woman's expression, hard and professional, softened. It was not pity. It was recognition, and a deep, profound sorrow. Mabel Harlow, who was equal parts Yaqui and Mexican and something else entirely, placed the cup on the bar. Her voice was low, and it held the same gravelly quality as the land itself. "Daughter of the stone," Mabel said, her words quiet but filling the room. "The one I knew who walked like the mountain. You come here at last, and you come empty-handed." Inaba did not flinch. She just nodded, a single, tired movement. "Mabel, he said you would keep it." Mabel nodded, her eyes tracing the line of dried blood on Inaba's arm. "He said you would come, if you were alive." She looked at Jonas again, her gaze lingering on his wound. "Both of you. You look like hell has spat you out." She came around the bar, pushing through a beaded curtain into a room in the back. "In here, before you fall." The back room was a kitchen, small and suffocatingly hot. A large, black cast-iron stove dominated one wall, radiating a heat that felt like a solid thing. A pot of beans bubbled on top. "Sit," Mabel commanded, pointing to 2 stools. She brought them 2 tin cups of water, and Jonas drank his in 3 greedy, painful swallows. Mabel looked at their wounds. "No doctor here, just whiskey and hot iron. You want it cleaned?" "Later," Inaba said, her voice urgent. "The box!" Mabel looked at her, then at Jonas. She did not ask. She was a woman who knew the weight of secrets. She nodded. She went to the stove, took a heavy poker, and jammed it into a crack in the stone hearth. Just beside the firebox, she grunted, pulling. A large, soot-covered flagstone scraped back, revealing a dark, square hollow beneath. Mabel reached deep into the shadow and pulled out a heavy, rust-covered iron box. It was a foot long, maybe 8 inches wide, and sealed with a simple latch. She carried it, using both hands, and placed it on the small kitchen table with a heavy, final thud. "He left it here," Mabel said. 6 months ago, the day before he left. He said it was the only thing that mattered. Said if he didn't come back for it in one full turn of the seasons, and if you did, it was yours." Inaba stared at the box. Her face, a mask of dust and exhaustion, was completely still. But Jonas, sitting beside her, saw her hand, the large, capable hand that had fired his pistol, that had held a knife, that had pulled him from the line of fire. It was hovering over the latch, and it was shaking. She could not open it. Jonas reached out, his own hand unsteady, and he flipped the rusty latch. It groaned in protest and sprang open. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there was not gold. There was no coin. There was paper, a sheaf of dry, brittle documents, bound in oilcloth. Inaba lifted them out, her movements now slow, almost reverent. She unwrapped the cloth. There were official-looking certificates, covered in legal script. There was a hand-drawn map, its lines precise, showing the Iron Horse Bluffs and the ranch, and a blue line, a thick, underground river that connected them both. There were mineral assays and water rights claims, all filed, all stamped with the seal of the territorial government. It was Hector's entire war, fought not with bullets, but with ink and paper. And at the bottom, there was a single folded piece of paper, a letter. Inaba picked it up. Her fingers, stained with her own blood, seemed clumsy. She unfolded it. It was a short note, written in a strong, clear hand. She read it silently. Jonas watched her face. He saw her eyes, those deep, black, unreadable pools, scan the words. He saw her thumb move, tracing the signature at the bottom, Hector Vega. And then the mountain crumbled. The iron control she held, the stoicism that was her armor, it all just broke. Her broad shoulders, which had carried the sky, began to tremble. Her head bowed, her eyes squeezed shut, and two fat, impossible tears tracked through the dust on her cheeks, leaving clean, stark lines. Her breath hitched, a ragged, choking sound, a sob that she refused to let escape. She did not make a sound, but her entire massive frame was shaking with a grief so profound, so deep, that Jonas felt his own throat tighten. The woman who had faced down gunmen, who had killed a man without flinching, was utterly broken by a name scrawled on a piece of paper. He had to do something. He was a man, and she was a woman in pain. The rest, the debt, the ranch, the color of their skin, it all fell away. He stood, his own wound screaming in protest, and he laid his hand on her back. It was a simple, hesitant gesture. His palm, calloused and dirty, rested between her shaking shoulder blades. He could feel the intense, furnace-like heat of her body through the thin fabric of her shift. He could feel the hard ridge of the old scar, the one from the knife, even through the cloth. He felt the tremor of her sobs run through her back and into his hand. "He believed you wouldn't quit," Jonas said, his voice a low, rough whisper, barely audible over the bubble of the beans. "I believe it too." The words and the touch, they were a key. Her shaking stopped. It did not taper off. It ceased, instantly, as if a switch had been thrown. She went perfectly, rigidly still. Then, slowly, she turned her head, and then her entire body, on the stool. They were face to face, so close. Their knees were almost touching. He was standing, and she was sitting, but her seated height nearly matched his. He was looking directly into her eyes. They were red-rimmed and wet, the black pupils blown wide, but they were not weak. They were, he thought, the strongest things he had ever seen. A mixture of pure, undiluted pain and an iron, unbending will. He could smell her, the journey, the fear, the fight, the sharp tang of her sweat, the acrid, metallic smell of her dried blood, the smoke from the barn, and under it all, something green and wild, like the sagebrush she had slept in as a child. He was drowning in her. He was at the edge of a cliff, and her gaze was the drop. He was driven by an instinct he did not know he possessed. He was overwhelmed. He lifted his other hand, the one that was not on her back. His fingers were rough, scarred, and they were trembling. She watched him, her wet eyes tracking his movement. He reached up, slowly, and with the pads of his first two fingers, he touched a single, damp strand of her black hair that was stuck to the tear track on her cheek. He gently, so gently, tucked it behind her ear. Anna frozen. Her entire body went rigid. Her breath stopped. It was, he realized, the first gentle touch she had known since Hector. The world had given her nothing but blows. And here was this, a caress. It was a shock to her system, more profound than any bullet. She stared at him, her eyes wide, searching his, and then, in the hot, silent kitchen, as if in a trance, Ana Paloma moved. She was the one who was taller, stronger, bigger. She leaned in. She had to lean down to reach him. He saw her face blur as it came closer. He saw her eyes close, her lips, soft and warm, brushed against his forehead. It was not a kiss of passion. It was not a promise. It was 1,000 things at once. It was a thank you for his words. It was an apology for his wound. It was an absolution for his past. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition that he was no longer her beast, but the man who had seen her break and had not looked away. Jonas's eyes slid shut. His breath, which he had been holding, came out in a ragged, shuddering gasp. His hand was still on her back. He did not pull her closer. He did not push her away. He simply stood there, receiving the benediction, his entire world narrowing to that single, soft point of contact. She pulled back, but only an inch. They stayed there, in that impossible, intimate space. For a second, two, he could feel the solid warmth of her body, his shoulder brushing against the firm, strong muscle of her stomach. He realized in that moment, that her sheer size, which had once intimidated him, did not make him feel small. Standing this close, his hand on her back, her breath on his face, he felt, for the first time in his life, safe. He felt protected. Out in the West, plenty of men died from guns, and plenty died from thirst. But there were others, who nearly died from a single touch that was too honest. Mabel Harlow was a woman who knew how to move in the shadows of other people's worlds. After cleaning and bandaging their wounds with a rough, practiced hand, stitching Jonas's side with a needle and fishing line that made him pass out for a minute, and packing Anaba's shoulder with a poultice of herbs that smelled like burnt pitch, she laid out the plan. The circuit court judge, "Bellamy, is in Larkspur Junction," she said, her voice a low, urgent rasp as she poured them all coffee. "He's there for 2 more days. He's a federal man. Pike can't buy him. He's the only one who will look at these papers and see law instead of just paper." "Larkspur Junction," Jonas said, his voice hoarse. He had tried to stand, and the world had tilted violently. "That's a 3-day ride. If we had horses, if we could even sit a horse." "We don't ride," Mabel said, her sharp eyes on Anaba. "We fly," she explained. Ezra Pike's Frontier Meridian Line, the very railroad that was the instrument of his greed, was their only hope. A freight train, one of Pike's own, was scheduled to pass through Dustfall Crossing, a desolate water stop, in less than an hour. It was heading east. It would pass right through Larkspur Junction. "It's a freight," Mabel said, handing Anaba a worn leather satchel to hold the iron box. "It slows at the crossing to take on water. It doesn't stop. You'll have to jump it. I have a friend who works the water tower. He owes me. He will look the other way for 90 seconds. He will also see that the door on the 3rd timber car is unlatched." She pushed them toward the door, handing Jonas a full water skin and a loaf of hard, dark bread. "Go! He will kill you if he finds you, but he will kill you for sure if you stay here." Dustfall Crossing was a blister on the flat. Empty plains. By the time they got there, walking a dry creek bed to stay hidden, the sun was a white-hot coin in the sky. Their wounds were on fire. Jonas's side felt as if it were full of broken glass. Anaba's limp had returned, the shrapnel in her knee aggravated by the long, fast walk. They heard it before they saw it, a low, guttural chuffing, a rumble in the tracks that they felt in their feet. Then the black plume of smoke, the train, a long black snake of iron and wood, slowing as it approached the towering, skeletal water tower. They hid behind a pile of discarded railroad ties. As the train screeched and steamed, its massive wheels slowing, they saw the 3rd car from the engine, a long, slatted car for carrying timber. The side door, as Mabel had promised, was cracked open a few inches. "Now," Jonas whispered. He ran, crouching, his body screaming in protest. He reached the car, pulled the heavy door. It slid back with a groan that was lost in the hissing of the engine. Inside, it was dark, filled with the clean, sharp smell of freshly cut pine. Anaba was right behind him. She was looking at the high floor of the car. It was level with her chest, with her bad knee, her wounded shoulder. "I'll lift," Jonas grunted. "You'll split in 2, she countered. "Just go," he hissed. He turned, braced his back against the car, and laced his fingers together. "Use my hands, then my shoulder. Go." She looked at him, her black eyes measuring his pain against their necessity. She nodded. She put her good foot into his locked hands. "Now," he gasped. He straightened his legs, pushing with every ounce of strength he had left, a sound like a tearing sheet ripping from his throat. The pain in his side was a pure, white light. But Anaba, even wounded, moved with that same shocking power. She used his lift, her own massive strength pulling her up, and she was inside. She immediately turned, her great shadow filling the doorway. She leaned down, her arm extended. "Give me your hand." Jonas, trembling and gray-faced, grabbed her forearm. He was a dead weight. He felt as if he were made of lead. It didn't matter. He grabbed her arm, and he was lifted. He was not pulled. He was lifted, as if he were a child, his feet dangling, and then he was on the floor of the car, rolling onto his back, gasping. The world spinning in dark, smoky circles. The door slid shut, plunging them into a hot, resin-scented darkness, just as the train gave a massive lurch, throwing them both against a stack of timber. The wheels groaned, and then, with gathering speed, they were moving. For a long time, they just lay there, the floor vibrating beneath them. The clack, 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 clack of the wheels, a hypnotic, driving rhythm. The car was not full. It was half filled with huge, rough-hewn pine logs, leaving a cramped, narrow space. Anaba sat, her back braced against the wall, but her knees were drawn up, and her head was inches from the roof. Her size, which had been a weapon, was now a cage. She looked, Jonas thought, like a captured eagle. Jonas lay on the floor, his head pillowed on a coil of rope, trying to breathe through the pain. The motion of the train was a constant, jarring agony. Hours passed. The small cracks in the wooden walls showed the sun passing its zenith. They were moving fast. Jazz 003 Jonas, unable to rest, crawled to the front of the car. He pressed his ear to the thin wooden wall that separated them from the car in front. He could hear voices. The vibration of the train carried them clearly. 2 men, guards, riding on the flat car just ahead. "Don't know why Pike's so fired up about this one piece of land," one voice said, rough and bored. "It's just dust and rocks. It ain't the land, idiot." A second, sharper voice replied, "It's the water and the line. He wants this valley clean before the senators arrive." "Clean? Yeah, clean." A dry chuckle. "He's got a whole car of cleaner just behind us. Dynamite. Enough to blast that Apache well and their whole damn nest at Iron Horse Bluff so deep they'll be drinking with the devil." Jonas felt his blood run cold. He pressed his ear harder against the wood. "What about that giant squaw?" the first voice asked. "The one who owns it, and that white fella who's supposedly serving her heard they burnt his ranch out. That's the other part of clean," the second voice said. Satisfaction in his tone. "We're setting the charge at Devil's Switchback. We're uncoupling the dynamite car, letting it roll back down the grade. It'll smash right into the old pass. Block it for a year. Pike says it'll look like a tragic accident. Or maybe, he says maybe savages tried to steal it and it went wrong. Either way, the well is gone, the pass is blocked, and Pike gets his way." Jonas crawled back to Anaba, his face pale. He relayed what he had heard, his voice a low, sick whisper. She did not rage, she did not weep. Her eyes went flat and hard as obsidian. She looked at the iron box, which she held in her lap. "He will not win," she said. It was not a hope, it was a sentence. The train began to slow. The rhythm of the wheels changed, and the air was filled with the long, high-pitched scream of brakes. "Devil's Switchback," Jonas whispered. He peered through a crack in the wall. He could see the sharp, dangerous curve of the track ahead, winding around a sheer drop. This was it. "The roof," Anaba said, looking up. There was a hatch, a small square used for loading. Jonas stood on a log, his side tearing, and pushed. It opened. Cold, rushing air filled the car. He climbed out, the wind ripping at him, threatening to tear him from the train. The world was a blurry, terrifying rush of speed. He turned and gave Anaba his hand. She came up through the hatch, not like a woman, but like a force, her mass emerging into the wind, her black hair instantly whipping free, a wild banner. The guards on the flat car ahead had their backs to them, focused on the switch. They were standing near the coupling, ready to pull the pin. They had to move. They were 200 feet from the engine. They ran, crouched low. They ran along the roof of their own car. The wind was a solid, screaming wall. Jonas, lean and desperate, moved like a wolf, his boots finding purchase. Anaba was something else. She was a moving fortification, her weight a low, stable center of gravity. Her massive frame a wall against the gale. A third man, a brakeman Jonas hadn't seen, was on the roof of the car just behind the engine. He turned. He saw them. His eyes went wide. He raised his hand. A shout lost in the wind, and fumbled for the pistol at his belt. Jonas ran, closing the distance. The man, panicked, drew his gun. He never got to fire it. Anaba, with two massive, impossible strides, was on him. The man tried to brace himself, but it was like a man trying to stop a buffalo. She did not slow. Her right hand, a fist the size of a ham, shot out. It connected with the man's chest with a thump that Jonas heard even over the wind. The man's feet left the roof. He flew backward, a rag doll. His gun firing once, uselessly, into the sky. He disappeared over the side. Jonas didn't even look back. He leaped the gap between the cars, landing hard. Anaba was right behind him, the car sinking under her weight. They were at the engine car. The tender, the engineer, his face a mask of grease, looked back through the side window. His eyes widened in terror. He saw Anaba, this wild-haired giant, and his first thought was not robbery. It was demons. He grabbed a rifle. Jonas saw the barrel swing around. He had one goal, the brake. He saw the large red lever inside the cab. "Anaba!" he yelled. She understood. As Jonas lunged for the cab door, Anaba moved in front of him. She did not try to get in. She became the door. She put her massive body between Jonas and the engineer, shielding him completely. The rifle exploded inside the cab, the sound deafening. Jonas heard the whack of the bullet, heard Anaba grunt, a deep, pained sound, but she did not move. She stood, a column of stone, her shoulder taking the hit, her hands braced on the side of the cab, while Jonas, protected by her flesh, lunged inside. The engineer, his rifle empty, was fumbling for a pistol. Jonas did not give him the chance. He put all of his weight, all of his pain, and all of his rage into one single, desperate heave. He grabbed the emergency brake lever and pulled it down. The world ended. A sound, a scream of 1,000 tortured metal souls, ripped the air apart. The train, its wheels locked, bucked like a dying animal. Jonas was thrown against the hot boiler, a searing pain on his arm, and then tossed back as the entire engine car shuddered to a violent, convulsive stop. They had stopped. 10 yards from the switch. The dynamite car still securely, uselessly, attached. The plan was ruined. The cab door was ripped open, not by the engineer, who was lying unconscious, but by 2 of Pike's guards who had run up from the flat car. They were met by Anaba, who was leaning against the cab, her arms slick with fresh blood, a grim, terrifying smile on her face. She hit the first man, but it was over. 2 more came. They had rifles. Jonas was dragged from the cab, his hands bound before he could even get his breath. Anaba, bleeding from a second bullet wound, finally sank to her knees, and they threw a rope over her, tying her like an animal. They were dragged, pushed, and kicked off the train and onto the dusty wooden platform of Larkspur Junction. The train had stopped right at the station. The head guard, his face purple with rage, raised his rifle, its butt aimed at Jonas's head. "You just cost Mr. Pike a lot of money, you son of a—" A whistle. It was not the train. It was high, clear, and official. Another train, a small, single-car engine with a federal seal on its side, was pulling into the station on the opposite track. The guard froze. Pike had money, guns, and a railroad. But Jonas and Anaba had a rusty iron box, a handful of papers, and the unbreakable, stubborn will to not back down even as they were being tied up and dragged from his own goddamn train. The church in Larkspur Junction had not heard a prayer in a decade. It was the only building in town with a roof strong enough to be considered official. Now, it was a federal courthouse. The pews were gone, replaced by mismatched chairs and benches. At the front, where an altar had once stood, a rough pine table had been set. Behind it sat Judge Horace Bellamy. He was a man who looked as worn down as the territory itself. His hair was a wild, silver mane, and his eyes, set deep in a face carved by sun and exhaustion, were the color of a faded blue shirt. But they were sharp. They were the eyes of a man who had seen everything and was impressed by nothing. 2 federal marshals, their faces hard and impassive, stood in the corners, their Winchester rifles held loosely, but ready. Jonas and Annaba stood in the center of the room, on the bare wooden floor. The ropes had been cut from their wrists, but the raw, red welts remained. They were a sight, filthy, caked in soot and dried blood, their clothes torn. Jonas was hunched over, his left hand pressed tight against the bloody, makeshift bandage on his side, his face a pale, waxy gray. Annaba stood beside him, her massive frame rigid, her arm held stiffly at her side, her face an unreadable copper mask. She was bleeding, again, from the new wound in her shoulder, a dark stain spreading on her torn shift. They looked less like plaintiffs and more like wreckage. Then the door swung open, and Ezra Pike entered. He was the opposite of the room. He was the opposite of them. He wore a fine black wool frock coat, a clean white shirt, and a string tie. He was freshly shaved, his silver hair neatly combed. He smelled of bay rum and expensive cigars. He was civilization. He was power. He was flanked by 2 city lawyers in pressed suits and, just outside the door, Jonas could see 4 of his gunmen, their hands resting on their holsters, their faces set in bored, arrogant sneers. Pike's gaze swept the room, dismissed the judge, and landed on Annaba and Jonas. A slow, thin-lipped smile of pure, confident contempt spread across his face. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth and cultured, "I must apologize for the state of these individuals. They are, as my men have just informed me, the very thieves who attempted to destroy my property. A wild Apache widow," he said, gesturing to Annaba as if she were an animal. And his smile widened as he looked at Jonas. A pathetic, spineless rancher, a man so broken he sold his own land, and now, it seems, has sold himself as her servant, or perhaps her pet. I demand they be jailed for interfering with federal commerce." Judge Bellamy looked at Pike. He looked at the lawyers. He looked at the gunman at the door. Then his gaze settled on Jonas and Annaba. He saw the blood. He saw the soot. "Mr. Pike," the judge said, his voice a dry rustle, "this court is not currently in session to discuss your commerce. It is here to review a federal claim. Sit down." The command was not loud, but it had the weight of iron. Pike's smile faltered, just for a second. He looked at his lawyers, who suddenly looked less confident. He gave a stiff nod and took a seat in the front row, a dark, coiled snake. "I have before me," Judge Bellamy said, "a request for an emergency hearing, filed by telegraph this morning by one Mabel Harlow of Cinder Wells, a claim regarding water rights and mineral deposits. I was, I admit, skeptical." The back door of the church opened. Mabel Harlow walked in. She was not dressed for court. She wore her same dusty skirt and canvas apron. She was carrying the rusty iron box. She walked with a steady, unafraid gait, right past Ezra Pike, who watched her with a look of pure hatred. She placed the box on the judge's table with a thud that echoed in the silent room. "It is all in there, Your Honor," Mabel said, her voice clear. Judge Bellamy opened the box. He took out the oilcloth bundle. He unrolled it. He put on a small pair of wire-rimmed spectacles and began to read. The silence in the church was absolute. The only sound was the dry shush of the judge turning a page. Jonas was swaying on his feet. He could feel Annaba's presence next to him, a solid wall of heat, the only thing keeping him upright. He could feel Pike's stare, a physical weight, boring into his back. The judge read for a full 10 minutes. He read the assays. He read the claims. He unfolded the map, his eyes tracing the blue line of the underground river. He held up the final, stamped document to the light from the window. Ezra Pike began to shift in his seat. His lawyers were whispering to him, their faces pale. Finally, Judge Bellamy took off his spectacles. He folded them and put them in his pocket. He looked at Pike. "Mr. Pike," he said, his voice flat, "you have done a commendable job of mapping this territory for your railroad. But it seems another man, a Mr. Hector Vega, did a more thorough job." Pike was on his feet. "This is an outrage, a forgery. That man was a half-breed thief, a traitor who, That man, Judge Bellamy's voice cut through Pike's, was also a federally commissioned surveyor whose credentials, I see, are fully in order. That man, before his death, established the Loma Vega Water and Mineral Trust. He filed these claims, legally, with the Territorial Office under federal statute. According to this document, he held it up, all rights to water, mineral, and passage, in perpetuity, beneath the Iron Horse Bluffs and the parcel known as the Broken Lantern Ranch, belong not to the railroad, not to the territory, but to the sole trustee. He paused, and his tired eyes found Annaba, to the widow, Annaba Loma. Pike's face was no longer civilized. It was a mask of purple, bulging rage. You cannot be serious. You will not allow this savage to stand in the way of progress, in the way of the United States. Progress, the judge said, his voice as cold as a high desert night, does not give you the right to steal Mr. Pike and the United States, which I represent, does not give you the right to violate federal law. He picked up his small wooden gavel. The trust is legal. The rights belong to Mrs. Loma. Any attempt to seize, impede, or otherwise interfere with this water or this land is a federal crime. He banged the gavel. Crack! The sound was final. It was the sound of Pike's world, his entire carefully constructed world of force and greed, shattering. She has no proof, Pike roared, his voice no longer smooth, but a raw, desperate bellow. My men were attacked by thieves. This is a conspiracy. He was killed by road agents. Was he? The voice came from the back of the church. A man stood up, an old man, in a faded blue army coat, his face scarred, one arm missing below the elbow. He was one of the town drunks Jonas had seen on the platform. Was he killed by road agents? Colonel, the man said, his voice shaking, but clear. Because I was with Hector Vega when he was a scout, and I was with him, up in the pass. When your men, the men from the Painted Creek militia, shot him from the rocks, I saw them. I saw you. The room went dead silent. Pike spun around, his face white. He had not just been beaten, he was being buried. And in that moment, the thin veneer of civilization, the frock coat, the expensive cigar, it all burned away. Ezra Pike was, and had always been, a butcher. He moved. He was not a fast man, but his rage was a blur. He did not reach for a lawyer. He reached inside his coat and pulled a short-barreled, .44 caliber revolver. He pulled it, aimed it, not at the judge, not at the old soldier, but at the source of his ruin. He aimed it, at point-blank range, at Annaba. You, he screamed, his face a contorted mask. You will not have it. Jonas was not thinking. He was not a hero. He was a broken-down man. His sight a sheet of agony, his mind a gray fog of pain. He had no plan. He only had one single overriding instinct, an instinct that had been forged in a hovel of rock and solidified by a touch to the cheek. He moved. He did not have time to speak. He did not have time to be brave. He simply lunged, a desperate, clumsy, falling lunge, his good shoulder slamming into Annaba's hip. No, he was heavy, but she was a mountain. He did not move her. He only shifted her. A single, vital 6 inches to the side. The gun exploded. The sound in the small church was a physical blow, a cannon shot that shattered the windows. Jonas felt, rather than heard. The shot. It was a white-hot poker, a branding iron, plunged into his back, just under the ribs, and driven straight through him. He did not just fall. He was thrown by the impact, slamming face first onto the dusty, splintered wooden floor. The world went silent. He tasted copper, hot and thick, in his mouth. He tried to breathe, and his lungs would not work. So he thought, his mind fading to black. This is it. Not the whiskey, not the rope. This. He was wrong. The crack of the Winchesters from the marshals was so loud it brought him back. He heard a scream, a heavy thud. He heard the sound of men, a chaos of boots, of shouting. He forced his head to turn. He saw Ezra Pike on the floor, his hand, the one that had held the gun, a bloody, shattered ruin, the gun skittering away. A marshal had his boot on Pike's neck. The other marshal had his rifle trained on the gunmen at the door, who had their hands, very suddenly, in the air. Judge Horace Bellamy was standing. His face was no longer tired. It was a mask of cold, federal fury. "Ezra Pike," the judge's voice boomed in the ringing silence. "You are under arrest for attempted murder in my courtroom, for the murder of Hector Vega, for conspiracy to destroy federal property, for the illegal seizure of assets, and for about," he took a breath, "a dozen other federal crimes that I'm going to enjoy writing down. Marshals, get this butcher out of my sight." Pike was dragged to his feet, his fine coat ripped, his face a mask of agony and shock. He was cuffed. As they hauled him, whimpering, past Anaba, he lunged, his face contorted. "You'll die on that land," he spat at her, a spray of bloody saliva. "You'll die, you savage bitch, you'll never hold it." Anaba Loma, who had not moved, who had watched him, watched Jonas, watched everything with those deep, black eyes, finally spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it filled the room, a low, heavy grinding of stones. "This land," she said, "was here long before you, and it will be here long after your words are dust." He was gone. Jonas lay on the floor, the world a blurry, tilted, impossible thing. He felt a shadow fall over him. He smelled sage and smoke and blood. He looked up. Anaba was kneeling beside him. Her size, her sheer, massive presence blotted out the world. Her face was close. He saw the tracks of her tears from the kitchen, still there, caked with dust. He tried to breathe, and it came as a wet, ragged cough. He spit, and a spray of bright red blood hit the floorboards. He managed a smile, a cracked, bloody, terrible smile. "Well," he rasped, his voice a ghost, "I guess I just worked past my time, ma'am." He saw her face break, the iron mask, the stone. It all shattered. Her lower lip trembled. A single, huge tear formed in her eye and fell, splashing on his cheek. She reached down, her enormous, calloused, blood-stained hand, and it found his. It wrapped around his hand, enveloping it, her warmth a sudden, desperate anchor in the cold, fading light. She leaned down, her wild hair a curtain, her voice a rough, broken whisper that was only for him. "You have," she said, her voice choking. "You have many more years to work for me." Revenge, in the West, wasn't always about a faster gun. Sometimes, it was just about dragging the light of the law, kicking and screaming, into a place that had only ever known the dark. It was a month before he could stand without the world tilting. It was 2 before he could ride in a wagon. Judge Bellamy had made them stay in Larkspur Junction, under the care of a federal doctor, until the bullet hole in Jonas's back had scarred over. Anaba, whose wounds were all of flesh and not of the lung, had been restless, pacing the small boarding house room, her size making the floorboards groan. When they finally returned, it was on a wagon supplied by Mabel, loaded with new tools, seed, and lumber, all of it paid for from a federal fund set aside for victims of Pike's terror. The Broken Lantern Ranch was just as they had left it, a field of ash and charcoal. The skeletons of the barn and the house stood black against the sky, but the land was not dead. The late afternoon sun, which had once been their enemy, now cast a long, gentle, golden light over the valley, and in the black, scorched earth, tiny, vibrant green shoots of grass were pushing up through the ash. The water from the well, which they had protected, was already working, healing the ground from below. They stood by the wagon, 2 solitary figures in the ruins of their world, and watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of soft gold and lavender. Jonas, his ribs tightly bound in white bandages that showed under his new shirt, began to unload the lumber. His movements were slow, careful, his face pale. Every lift sent a sharp, pulling pain through his side. Anaba took the hammer. She did not wait. She walked to the charred foundation of the house and began her work. He would set a new upright post, struggling to get it plumb, and she would drive the spikes with 2 economical blows. Thwack, thwack. The sound was clean and final, an answer to the gunfire that had been the last sound here. She worked with a tireless, fluid power. The new pine board smelled sharp and clean. He watched her, the muscles in her broad back and massive arms contracting and relaxing under her simple canvas shirt. Sweat ran down her temples, tracing a path down her strong neck, over her collarbone, and disappearing into the fabric. She was not just building a house. She was forging a new reality with every strike. They worked until the sky was a deep, star-flecked purple and their bodies were screaming for rest. They did not have a house. They had a frame, 4 new walls, open to the night air, and a temporary, slanted roof of raw planks over one corner. It was enough to keep the dew off. Jonas lit a single kerosene lantern, and its small, yellow light cast huge, dancing shadows of their 2 bodies against the new, pale wood. They sat on the floor, their backs against a wall, sharing a simple meal of bread and beans from a can. The wind, the constant sighing voice of the territory, blew through the open frame. It carried the smell of new pine, the faint, metallic tang of the old ash, and the clean, sharp perfume of the wild sagebrush. Annabelle was rubbing her shoulder, the new scar a puckered, angry red against her copper skin. Jonas watched her hands, those large, powerful, scarred hands. He looked from her shoulder to the old white line of the knife scar on her forearm, to the burn mark on her wrist. He saw her, a map of all the pain the world had thrown at her, and she was still here, still swinging a hammer. A feeling he could not name, a heavy, thick emotion, rose in his chest, making it hard to breathe. It was admiration, it was gratitude, it was something more, something deeper, something that terrified him. He had to say it. He had to change the words, or they would be trapped by the old ones forever. "You told me," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the wind, "that I was your beast." She stopped rubbing her arm. She turned her head, her black eyes finding his in the dim, flickering light. "I believed it," he continued, his gaze dropping to his own scarred hands. "I was an animal, trapped by my own hate, my own failure." He looked up at her, and his eyes were raw. "But on that train when you stood in front of me, when you took that bullet," he swallowed, his throat dry. "And in that church when I saw him," he did not need to finish. She knew. "I'm not your beast anymore, Annabelle," he whispered. "I'm not your servant. This isn't about the debt. I don't know what this is. I just know I don't know where else to put my life. Then right here, next to yours." The confession hung in the air, fragile as a spider's web. It was the truest, most dangerous thing he had ever said. Annabelle was silent for so long the wind seemed to die. She just looked at him, her face a mask of shadow and faint, golden light. He felt a familiar, cold dread. He had been a fool. He had spoken out of turn. He had mistaken survival for something else. He looked away, his face burning with a shame deeper than any he had felt before. And then, she moved. She did not speak. She reached out her hand, the massive, builder's, fighter's hand. She laid it, palm down, over his, which was resting, clenched, on his knee. Her hand was huge. It completely enveloped his. It was warm, and rough, and calloused. He went perfectly still. Then, her thumb, which was as strong as a lock, began to move. It drew a slow, deliberate, incredibly gentle circle on the back of his hand. Once. Twice. A gesture of such profound, unexpected tenderness, coming from this woman, this mountain of strength and pain, that it shattered his defenses. He felt a sting behind his eyes. He turned his hand over, his fingers finding hers, lacing between them. Annabelle stood. She did not let go of his hand. She pulled. It was a gentle, insistent tug. He stood, drawn up from the floor, his bandaged ribs protesting. He was standing in front of her. He had to look up. He had forgotten. In these last weeks, the sheer, staggering difference in their size. He had to tilt his head back to meet her eyes, to see her face, which was looking down at him. The lantern light was behind her, so her face was in shadow, but he could see the glint of her eyes. He saw the warrior in them, The killer, the survivor. But he also saw something else. Something he had only seen in the kitchen at Mabel's. He saw the woman, the widow, the person who had lost a husband, a home, a people, and all safety. He saw the woman who was, in this one terrifying moment, choosing to trust again. She raised her other hand, the one that was not holding his. She laid it against his cheek, her palm covering his jaw, her thumb brushing the scar on his neck, and then Anaba Loma, the giant Apache widow, leaned down. The kiss was slow. It was awkward. It was two people who had forgotten how. Her lips were soft and dry from the desert air. They met his. It was a simple, hesitant press. A question. He answered. He brought his own hand up, his fingers trembling, and laid it on her waist. He could feel the solid, unyielding muscle beneath the canvas. He pulled, gently. The kiss changed. The hesitation was gone, replaced by a sudden, starving hunger that had been building since the night in the rock hovel. Her mouth opened against his, her lips becoming softer, more insistent. It was no longer a question. It was a claim. He groaned, a low sound in the back of his throat, and his hand moved from her waist, up her back, to the base of her neck. His fingers tangled in the thick, coarse, clean mass of her hair. He pulled her down, deeper, his need as desperate as hers. Their breath mingled, short and sharp and ragged. He tasted the dust on her, and the salt, and something that was just her. She made a sound, a low rumble in her chest, and her arms, her massive, powerful arms, encircled him. They locked behind his back, and she lifted him, pulling him off his feet, crushing him against her. Jonas was enveloped. He was surrounded by her strength, by her warmth. His face was pressed into the curve of her neck, his arms wrapped around her shoulders, his hands fisted in her hair. He could feel the frantic, heavy pounding of her heart against his own ribs, a drumbeat that matched his. She was so strong. She held him as if he weighed nothing. He felt her lips move from his, tracing a hot, wet path along his jaw, to his ear, and then down, to his throat. He tilted his head back, giving her access, a low, shuddering sound escaping him. He planted a kiss on her collarbone, feeling the solid bone beneath her warm, copper skin. He found her mouth again, and this time there was no awkwardness. It was a deep, searing kiss that spoke of pain and survival, and a loneliness so profound it had almost killed them both. She was still holding him, her arms a vice, and she began to move, walking backward, carrying him with her, never breaking the kiss. They stumbled, locked together, toward the dark corner of the frame where they had laid out their bedrolls. A simple straw mattress, 2 thick wool blankets, piled on the new pine floor. They fell onto it, a tangle of limbs, a single, unified shadow in the flickering lantern light. The light cast their merged silhouette, huge and dancing, onto the new, raw wood of the unfinished wall. Outside, the desert wind picked up, a high, lonely sound. It blew through the open frame, catching the edge of a piece of canvas Jonas had hung to block the worst of the draft. The canvas fluttered, a soft, rhythmic thwap-thwap against the wood, and mixed with the sound of the wind. Coming from the dark corner were other sounds, a soft, low laugh, choked off, a hushed, urgent whisper, a sharp, indrawn breath, and then only the sound of the wind, and the night, and the land. Later, much later, the lantern had burned low, its light a dim, warm, amber glow. The wind was quiet. In the corner, 2 bodies were wrapped in the wool blankets. Jonas lay on his back, his bandaged chest rising and falling. Anaba lay beside him, her massive, heavy arm draped over his stomach, her hand resting over his heart. His hand, in turn, was woven with hers, his fingers lost in her grip. They were not sleeping. They were not speaking. They were just breathing, in and out, in the quiet, safe darkness. 2 survivors, who had been to the bottom of the world, listening to the single, steady, and finally peaceful beat of each other's hearts. Several months passed. The high, cruel sun of the desert summer softened into the gentle, golden light of autumn. The wind still blew, but the air no longer felt like a furnace. The Broken Lantern Ranch was no longer a name spoken with a sigh. It was no longer a field of charcoal and bones. Using Hector's map, and with funds from the federal restitution, Jonas had hired a drilling team from Larkspur Junction. They had drilled, not at the old well, but 200 yards east, at a spot Hector had marked with a simple X. They went down 40 feet, 50, 60, and then they hit it. It was not a seep. It was a river. The water that came up was not the silty, lukewarm liquid of the old well. It was crystal clear, and so cold it made their teeth ache. It was the lifeblood of the valley, and it was now theirs. It gushed, steady and strong, into a new stone cistern. Life returned, not as a crawl, but as a flood. The grasses fed from below, grew thick and green. The few cattle they bought with the remaining funds grew fat, and word spread. Wagons began to arrive at the ranch, not with gunmen, but with farmers, ranchers from 20 miles away. Their own creeks dried to a trickle, came to the ranch. They came to buy water, hauling it away in barrels. They came to buy the rich hay that Jonas and Inaba now cut and baled. They came, paid in coin, and they spoke in low, respectful tones to the giant Apache widow and the scarred, quiet man who stood beside her. One afternoon, Jonas took a plank of fresh, white pine, and with his father's old knife, the one Inaba had kept for him, he carved a new sign. It took him 2 days, his hand, now steady, cutting deep, clean lines. When it was done, they hung it on a new post at the entrance to the ranch. It did not say Broken Lantern. It said Loma Merrick Springs, and beneath that, in smaller, clear letters, land kept by its keepers. The name sealed it. It was not his, it was not hers. It was theirs. It was not a debt. It was a partnership, forged in blood and sealed in water. One morning, Jonas stood leaning against the new corral fence, a cup of hot coffee in his hand. The scar on his back was a dull, pulling ache, a permanent reminder. He was watching Inaba. She was at the new well, drawing water for the house. She worked the new iron pump, her arm moving with a smooth, powerful, tireless rhythm. The sun caught the blue-black shine of her hair, which she now wore in 2 thick braids, bound with leather. Her massive shoulders and arms, bare in a simple shirt, flexed with the movement. The muscles in her back were a map of power. He was no longer afraid of that power. He was no longer intimidated by her size. He realized, mesmerized by it. He watched her, and the simple, domestic act of pumping water seemed, in her, an act of creation, as if she were personally pulling the life from the earth. He smiled, a slow, easy expression that had become, in these last months, his new face. He walked over to her as she set the full, heavy buckets down. "You know," he said, his voice a low, easy drawl. "If I'm still working off that original debt, ma'am, I'm starting to think you might have miscalculated the interest." He gestured to the new house, the new barn, the fields. "This is feeling like a life sentence." Inaba stopped. She turned to him, her hands on her hips. She was, as always, immense, a mountain of a woman. But the hardness was gone from her face. Her black eyes, which had been flat and cold, were now deep, and they held a warmth that was, he thought, brighter than the sun. And then she did a thing that was still so rare it stopped his heart. She smiled. It was not the small, hesitant twitch he had seen by the fire. It was a full, radiant, brilliant smile. It lit her entire face, erasing the scars, the pain, the years of loss. It was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and it made the entire valley seem to brighten. "You will work for me until this land stops breathing." "Jonas Merrick," she said, her voice, still low, now held a rich, warm, gravelly sound, like a chuckle. "And I," she placed a large, wet hand on the iron pump handle, "do not intend to let this land stop breathing." It was a warning. It was a promise. It was, he realized, the closest she would ever come to a proposal. In the afternoon, they rode. They had horses now, a strong bay for him, and a massive, broad-backed buckskin that was the only animal in the territory capable of carrying her for any distance. They rode up to the ridge of the Iron Horse Bluffs, the place Hector had seen it all from. They sat their horses side by side, the wind whipping their hair, their jackets flapping. From here, they could see everything, their valley, the green, vibrant patch of their land, a jewel in the high desert. They saw the glint of the water in the cistern. They saw the small, solid, new pine house, a plume of smoke rising from its chimney. They saw it all. It was not a grave. It was a genesis. It was a world, reborn from ash, love, born in the West. Born from gunfire and cinders, it is not the soft, sweet promise of an Eastern drawing room. It is not about poetry or delicate words. It is a hard, practical, brutal decision. It is the choice to stand next to someone when the entire world is screaming and lighting fires and trying to burn you both to the ground. It is the act of seeing the person beside you, not as you wish they were, but as they are scarred, broken, and strong, and choosing to plant your feet. That is how Jonas and Inaba loved. It was not because fate had written it in the stars. It was because they had looked at each other in the firelight, in the blood, in the dirt, and they had recognized the same stubborn, unquenchable, impossible fire in each other's eyes. The kind of fire that no storm and no man could ever put out. That night, they sat on the porch of their new, finished, solid house, a real porch. Jonas was in a rocking chair his father had built, one of the few things he had salvaged from the fire. Inaba sat on the top step, her back leaning against the post, her size making the new wood seem slender. Jonas reached his hand down, and she, without looking, met it, her large, rough fingers laced with his. They sat in the comfortable, familiar silence of two people who no longer needed words. The night was alive. The sound of crickets, a chorus that had been absent for so long, filled the air. They heard the low sigh of the wind through the new fences. They heard the steady, peaceful drip, drip, drip of the overflow from the water cistern. It was a music only two people who had been to the borders of hell could truly hear. It was the sound of life. Jonas looked at their joined hands, his pale and scarred, hers dark and powerful. "That first day," he said, his voice a low, quiet murmur. "When you rode in here, and I saw you, I thought you were the end of the world. When you told me I had to serve you, from dawn till dusk I was so sure my life was over, that there was nothing left." Inaba was quiet for a long moment. She leaned her head back against the post, looking up at the billion glittering stars that pressed down on the dark valley. "And she said, her voice now warm and deep and soft, the gravel finally worn smooth. "I thought I had just hired another pair of hands, another broken man to do the heavy work." She turned her head, her black eyes finding his in the starlight. She squeezed his hand. "I did not know," she whispered, "that I was finding a heart. One strong enough to share this land with. Friends of the West. If this story, if it made your heart remember the smell of sage after a rain, or the sound of a distant hoofbeat in the twilight, if it reminded you that somewhere, out there are still people trying to keep their promise to the land, then stay with us. Stay here, by this fire, because there are so many more stories to tell. Stories of men and women who thought they had lost everything only to find the one thing that was worth more than all the gold in the hills. Thank you for listening to this story. We want to hear from you. Please, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from. And share your thoughts on whether you believe love can truly bloom from ashes, just like it did at the Loma Merrick Springs. If you want more Wild West stories, filled with this much gunfire and this much heart, be sure to hit that subscribe button for Wild West Stories 1850. Like this video, and give us your support by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more folks out there.